Well, good morning and welcome to the Sports Bar Show, chewing the fat and talking balls. And I'm happy to say, at the Sports Bar this morning, manager Brent Peters. Good morning.
Good morning, Stephen. How you doing?
Not too bad. Where's this sunshine come from, sir?
Listen, it's a beautiful day out there, and you've banned me from being outside. I've got a lock in here. I'm going to be in this greenhouse.
Listen, we've got to have the connection. We can't have any hiccups this morning. That is for sure.
Exactly. That's I fully endorse that 100%. I really do. Anyway, because time's going on, and I'm really I'm proud and privileged that we've attracted our guest today. But before I introduce him, I'd just like to say a couple of things to you, Steve. Really, you're a true football man in every sense of the word. I know your team's Burnley, but you love football. As my team's Manchester United, and I love football. Now, when I'm watching a football match, when I'm not involved in it, I sit there with the TV on. I won't remember, I'm going to tell you the tale. I want to remember trying to watch a live football match in a public house. And because there was that much noise on, and it came to half time, and I wanted to listen to what the experts were having to say to learn off them, I went to the landlord. I couldn't hear anything. So I went to and I couldn't concentrate. So I went to the landlord. I said, is there any chance I can take this pint home? What do you mean? I said, well, I need to take this pint home. I said, I can't listen to, I like to listen to what's going on. I'm going to go home with this pint, but I'm not wasting my pint and I'm not drinking it fast. So he said, yeah, if you want, because that's the kind of person. So I can't do to sit and watch football where there's a noisy environment. I want to concentrate. I concentrate on football like it's a film. And what I kind of like to do is listen to what our experts, when I say experts, people that have been at the top end of the game, and listen to what they have to say about the game and about the manager and about the players. And I kind of judge myself and think, are they on the same wavelength as me, or am I on the same wavelength as them? And that's how I kind of judge myself every time. Now, when we watch football, especially when we're watching international football, you see some obviously top managers, top coaches, top players, because it's the elite of the game. And I often wonder, what are these people like off camera? We see them in their demeanour. We see them like at the side of the pitch. We see them controlling games of football. But we don't know what these people are like off camera. They're like me and you at the end of the day. They're good human beings. Now, luckily, or not luckily, because he's a very, very knowledgeable guy, our guest today has had the distinct pleasure to work alongside, and I mean alongside, if you think about a marriage where it's a man and a wife, well, we'll put that into football. His right-hand man is always his manager, his head coach, or I should have said the head coach, his right-hand man, is not his assistant on the field. It's the guy off the pitch who controls all the media activity and everything that goes with it.
A bit like me and you, Brent.
A bit like me and you, exactly. Now, he's had the distinct pleasure of working alongside the likes of Howard Wilkinson, Kevin Keegan, Sven-Goran Eriksson, Steve McLaren, Fabian Capello, Roy Hodgson. And you know what? He was directly involved in the appointment of the current England manager. And I'm not just saying this, I said it at the time. When Gareth Southgate got appointed as the England manager, if you're a football person, and you look at what Gareth Southgate's about and you look at what Club England's about, I honestly thought at the time, and still do, that Gareth Southgate was an excellent, truly excellent appointment. And I'm also led to believe that our guest today, kind of in 2018, he was one of the front runners to become the Scottish Football Association chief executive. Now, unfortunately, whatever happened, people make decisions and they don't always make the right decisions. And this is me saying it now. In my honest, humble opinion, there's a lot of issues up in Scotland at the minute. And I think that Scottish football and any big wigs listening into our show today could do no worse, I'm telling you, should be knocking on the door of our guests, because our guests could do an absolute wonderful job, not only for the English FA, which he's proved, but the Scottish FA. Would you welcome a really top, knowledgeable, great guy in Adrian Bevington?
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm looking around to see who the guest is. Sounds like a brilliant fella. Can I meet him, please?
I'm going to say, Adrian, you better put that £5 in the post.
I think it needs to be more than a £5 after that. Blimey, that's some great billing, that is, Brent. Thank you.
But it is no problem, Adrian. But I'll tell you what, 100% fully, completely true. Anyway, I'll just leave you to Steve for a minute, but it's brilliant.
Thanks very much, guys. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. Lots to cram in this morning, Adrian, while you're with us on the Sports Bar Show. But we'll go back to the beginning, because your first love is Middlesbrough Football Club. Has been from a boy, and that was your first real job in football, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a long time ago now. Back in the sort of 94 sort of time, I think it was. So Brian Robson just got into Borough with Steve Gibson as the owner, who's still there now, as we all know. And it was a whole new period for the club. And I'd trained as a reporter on the old YTS days with ICI, as I'm sure is known to a lot of you guys across that part of the world. Very big in the northwest and the northeast of England. And I was a reporter for a couple of years in the local paper there. And fortunately, my break was that ICI were heavily involved around Middlesbrough Football Club at the start of the Premier League. And they started a PR department. And the key people who came to form the PR department came from ICI. And then they brought me in at that particular juncture. And it was obviously a dream to work for the club. All I'd ever wanted to do as a young boy was to play for the club. I played schoolboy football for Middlesbrough Schoolboys, which was a really fertile area in the mid-80s when Middlesbrough won the English Schools Trophy 3 times in about 6 years. And that had always been my dream. So technically, I guess it's as close as you're going to get to being the next best thing to work at the club. But it was a great experience. I mean, Brian is and I'm sure people have met Brian over the years. Brian's an incredibly humble person, considering what he's achieved in the game. He doesn't walk around strutting around as if he's a peacock. He's a really nice, friendly, welcoming man. And it was, for someone like myself, it was a daunting prospect to go and knock on Brian Robson's door to interview him for the programme and things like that. But he couldn't have been more friendly, him and Viv Anderson and Big Gordon McQueen. And then during that period, we left Ayresome Park, moved to the Riverside, brought in big money signings, starting with Nick Barmby was 5.2 million, something like that, smashed the transfer record of the club by about £4 million overnight. And then Juninho came in, which obviously really broke the mould. The team had been promoted and were doing well in the Premier League. Then stabilised year one, summer of 96, which was just an unbelievable summer anyway. But then we brought in Emerson from Porto, who was a real good player. Didn't quite fulfil it at Borough. And then Fabrizio Ravanelli came in that summer as well. Yeah, I mean, he scored in the Champions League final in the May, and then he was playing for us 2 months later. It was great days. Obviously, didn't quite work out on the pitch with the relegation, the 3-point deduction, but reaching cup finals for the first time, and just the whole media buzz around Middlesbrough during that 96-97 season was absolutely crazy times. I think it was measured that we were only behind Man United insofar as media exposure that particular season. So that says a lot in itself. So I was there until I think it was the October-November 97 when I then moved on to the FA.
Yeah. What was interesting, I found out yesterday, was that when you used to take your holidays from your first employment, you used to go and work at Middlesbrough in your part time to get your foot in the door.
Yeah, that's true. And seems a long time ago now, but I was working full time in local government. A regular 9-to-5 type job there, not particularly high status. And before the full time position came on with Middlesbrough, I was doing a lot of writing for the match programme, covering games for the telephone services we had back in those days. And during the build up to the departure of from Ayresome Park, every time I took holiday, I would go and work for the club, and it was free of charge at the time. but it paid dividends in the end, because they got promoted, and that was again a bit of fate, going for you. And I got a phone call saying, "Would you come and work full time?" And so, if I hadn't done that, I probably wouldn't have got the opportunity. So, I always, when I speak to young people, particularly going around universities and speaking to people, it's about getting that experience and showing that you're willing to get your hands dirty, roll your sleeves up, and not just think, I'm doing one particular job. You've got to show commitment, particularly in this day and age.
Yeah, and it came at a time when Middlesbrough were going through that rebirth, as you say, with Brian Robson and the move from Ayresome Park to the Riverside. Really exciting times with Steve Gibson in charge as well.
Yeah, and look, Steve is, without Steve, Middlesbrough doesn't exist in the
way. It
won't
happen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people look. Steve's got a fantastic reputation, deservedly, for being one of the very best chairmen in the business. And without Steve's vision, his drive, and his long-standing commitment, Middlesbrough just wouldn't have achieved anything like it did during the past 25, 30 years. When you think about it, Middlesbrough, an FA Cup final, 3 League Cup finals, winning the League Cup once, a UEFA Cup final, the UEFA round of 16 in their first season. Yeah. Signing players. I mentioned Ravanelli, Juninho, Emerson, but then signing people like Alan Boksic, Mendieta, Zenden. Then Gareth Southgate, who for me was probably the. I'm sure we'll come on to Gareth in a later conversation, but as a Middlesbrough player, I think Gareth is probably the best signing that Middlesbrough Football Club have ever made in its history.
What was it about Gareth Southgate that you could see that he was quality?
Well, I'm quite fortunate that we're a similar age, and during our time with England, we would be in the breakfast room frequently together in the morning, and I wouldn't say every morning, but occasionally you'd sit and you have a bit of breakfast with him because you're one of the first up. And I just found Gareth really easy to speak to. And you don't need to spend a great deal of time in his company to realise the thoughtfulness, the integrity, the hard work. He's just, without building up any more than I normally do, he's just the epitome of what you want in a professional footballer. And I just think Gareth, he maxed out on his career. He can turn around and look himself in the mirror, or look at anybody in the eye and say, "Look, I gave myself absolutely every opportunity." I could be wrong on this, but I seem to recall the year leading into the World Cup in Brazil, when he was Middlesbrough captain, his first year at Borough. I think I don't think he consumed any alcohol during that period because he was preparing for that World Cup and so professional about it. But also, I think at the time there was some new sort of trousers that people were wearing for even during sleep patterns and things to help with your circulation and rest. He adopted that. Anything that he could do to give himself, the best opportunity of being a top professional, he embraced, and not wacky ideas, because he's a really, he's an easy, sensible person to talk to, but ultra professional. Unfortunately for him in the World Cup in Japan, when we played Brazil, I should say, is he didn't actually get on the pitch, which was a real blow to him. But he was just a total professional. And I think any young player that's spent time working around Gareth, whether it be now or back in the days when he was at Aston Villa or at Middlesbrough, when he was a senior pro, will have learned so much from him.
Yeah, certainly. And then moving on from Middlesbrough, then, Adrian, how did the opportunity arise to team up with, be part of Club England?
Well, that was old-fashioned newspaper adverts, the Guardian media section, and they were looking for a media relations officer, I think was the title, press officer. I applied for it. I'd never lived outside Middlesbrough before. I was married by then. Didn't really expect to get it. 2 or 3 interviews with 1 or 2 people, including led by David Davis, and I eventually got the job. And suddenly it was, wow, I've now got to up sticks and moved out of London pretty sharpish. And that was a monumental challenge, an upheaval in my own life. And the salary obviously was an increase on what I was earning at Middlesbrough, but it still wasn't making me a rich person by a long chalk. And, moving to London, still maintaining my property up in the northeast. My wife was still living up here for a year, so I was living in all sorts of, kind of living like a student, really. On one hand, I'm living in shared accommodation that was something that I wasn't used to, and then on the flip side, I'm walking into Lancaster Gate, and you're involved with the media around the FA Cup draw or the England team, and it was quite a surreal set of circumstances. But again, I kind of adopted the approach that I'm really going to throw myself into this. I was very determined and very ambitious, and one of the great breaks that I had, I was designated the under-21s team, but I was also tasked with working with the development teams as well. And it was the time that Howard Wilkinson had just come in, and I was pretty nervous and wary of Howard. Obviously, he had a very big reputation in the game, a hard reputation.
Yeah,
and I remember going to meet him at Stockport County. I think it was the first time I met him in a private room, because we were playing England, we were playing France there, and sitting down with Howard. And I was really nervous going to meet him, and actually he was top class. And Howard and I ended up forming a brilliant working relationship. But during that period, I worked with people like Pete Taylor with the 21s, Howard across the groups, particularly with I think Howard had the 18s at the time, but Les Reed was involved. He'd just come back into the FA. You have people like Martin Hunter, Kenny Swain, John Peacock, all those sort of guys. And I would do during international periods, I would be expected to work as like one of the junior pressers around the senior team. I'd be the lead person around the 21s, but I would make sure I was trying to get to as many of those development games as possible during the 2 weeks, and trying to build interest through inviting media along, just to generate that level of interest and build it up. And that got me a lot of credibility in the bank with the coaches I've just mentioned, because they knew I worked with them. And that was probably the best thing I ever did in my professional life, quite frankly.
Yeah, and what was said at the interview, and what was the selling point? What was your vision moving forward with Club England?
It wasn't a vision like that at all. I mean, look, we're going back.
What was it then?
Club England didn't exist then. I mean, again, your timing's timing can be so much for you in life, and I think I got the job literally just after England had got that point in Rome when Paul Ince had the bandaged headband, and Gazzo played really well that night in Rome.
Yeah.
So I joined literally just after that, and so it was all about the build up to to World Cup '98, and I was a junior person in quite a small organisation. There was 100 people work for the FA at the time in Lancaster.
Was it quite nerve-wracking then walking in? Did you have to kind of, you look like you were like a duck. You're looking gracious above the water, but under the water.
I'm not sure I was, to be fair, but for me it was an honour, and it's like I'm looking at Brent there with his England shirt on the on the wall behind him, and from myself, I remember as a young lad, as well as I wanted to play for Middlesbrough, I wanted to be part of the England setup. I wanted, the old Admiral tracksuits and all of that sort of scene. I loved football. I was an absolute football addict from as long as I can ever remember being alive, quite frankly. I was a kid who always had the ball every day of the week, morning, noon and night when I was in the classroom. So all I'd ever wanted to do was be a footballer. And so to walk into Lancaster Gate, which I remember from those cup draws you used to see on the third round on a Saturday, sometimes got shown on TV in the late 70s, and then listening to it on the radio with all the balls clanking around and everything and all of that. That was just such history for me. So I kind of I embraced it, and I wanted to get to know as many people as possible within the business. And yes, I was kind of a little bit nervous, a little bit daunted by it, the whole thing of moving to London, but just really worked as hard as I could to try and develop as many relationships as possible in a short period of time. And thankfully, that's what happened. But I didn't have it wasn't a great, this is my vision at the interview. It was kind of, they were just deciding whether I would fit in or not, I think, as much as anything else.
Just kind of roll your sleeves up and you're willing to put a shift in for the cause, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you've been involved in, is it 5 World Cups you've been involved in? Worked with many managers through the time. Can you tell us a few stories about the individual managers, the way that their mindset works? Because I suppose the communication between yourself and the managers is different in all parts.
Yeah, and it's interesting, obviously 5 World Cups, and also I think it was 3 Euros with England. I worked 1 Euros for a year leading into it with 2016 with the Welsh as well. But it wasn't just the senior teams tournament. I mean, I did a lot of my best work that I enjoyed most would be with Pete Taylor with the under-21s and Howard Wilkinson, also with the 21s. And I went to Nigeria in 1999 for the under-20 World Cup with, a really, really weakened squad that didn't have a hope in hell of actually winning that tournament with the squad that we took. But it was damn hard while we were out there, but it was such an unbelievable experience working with Chris Ramsey in that group. Howard was someone who, once I got to know Howard, we built a really strong bond of trust. And, I wasn't someone who was on the phone to Howard every 5 minutes. And I was really disappointed when Pete Taylor moved on from the 21s, and it was quite a big political play within the FA at the time. Pete was really upset. A lot of the media were very annoyed with Howard because they felt Pete was being forced out. I'll never know the full details of that, but Pete was someone who we had a small team of coaching staff in. Dave Sexton, who was just a genial man. I love Dave Sexton so much. Pete Bonetti, who's obviously recently passed away as well. And Sammy Lee. That was the coaching staff with Pete Taylor. And we had, the players during that period that came through and then went on to form pretty much a lot of Sven-Göran Eriksson's team. So that was an unbelievable group. And Pete and I, we built a lot of trust, and we also built the crowds up dramatically. We went from playing in front of 5,000-6,000 to suddenly we were playing in front of 33,000 or 32,000 at Derby. Full houses, pretty much. We took the team on tour, but what we did is whether it be Howard or whether it be Pete, whichever team it was, we'd go and do an announcement of the fixture at the venue. Then we do another follow-up when the squad was announced, and we try to make the team as accessible and available. And I remember people like Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Emile Heskey doing loads of press for me, and I would always sit down and talk to them and try and explain, look, we want to try and get a crowd in, and suddenly we've got a wave of momentum going. And I used to tease it into local media that, well, look, Derby got 30,000 plus or whatever, and I know your capacity is only 26,000, but can you top it? Or then we'd go somewhere else, and can you beat the record? And this was like probably about 1999, 2000, 2001. Great building that along. I remember Thierry Henry playing at Derby for the France under-21 side. I think we beat them 2-1 or 2-0 at a packed Pride Park, and that was an unbelievable night. So Pete was someone I had a really close relationship with, and Howard that was more of a slow burner. But by the time Howard took over, when Kevin Keegan resigned in the tunnel at Wembley, or in the dressing room at Wembley, I should say, I was the first person that privately marked Howard's card. He was going to get a call. I rang him from the tunnel. He was on the bus going back to the hotel with the 21s who'd watched the game. And I said, you better get your bag packed because you'll be getting a phone call shortly. You're going to be summoned back here as far as I can see it. And then Howard, we flew out to Finland for a World Cup qualifier, having lost the game to Germany. The mood was, it was tough. The media were really all over us. Howard, he had his friends in the media, but he also had a lot of people who weren't necessarily his biggest champions. And we had players dropped out. Tony Adams injured in the game against Germany. David Beckham was either injured or suspended. Sol Campbell likewise. And I remember Howard calling me to his room on the lunchtime. We were due to fly from Luton that afternoon out to Helsinki on the Monday, then play the game on the Wednesday night back then. And so I knocked on his door. I was a little bit apprehensive. And I walked in, and Howard, there was 2 doors into his room. He was stood having a shave, wet shave, towel around him. And he never actually turned around and looked at me. So he's looking at me through the mirror, and he's got his wet shave razor, and so every stroke of the razor he goes, right, Edit. Adam's art, Campbell's art, Beckham's art. It's going on like this. And he says to me, I won't say the exact word, but to effect,
get your boots on.
Who the bloody hell's your captain? And so I'm like, he's not really asking me this. He's just talking to himself, and he's not really asking me this. So, but then, as is with Howard, there was this big pause, and you didn't know whether that was a pause before he then was going to deliver his next iteration, or whether it was
a question.
Yeah. So nothing further came. So I sort of said, look, I don't know what your team is. It's not for me to get involved in this, really. All I would say to you is that when we land in Helsinki tonight, we've got to do a big press conference, and it's the press are not happy. It's going to be really, really lively in there, big time. So whoever does the press with you tonight is going to be someone who can deal with it and also give some confidence in how they speak. So I said, I've no idea who's in your team. And like I said, I'm not trying to pick your team for you. I said, all I would say is if Gareth Southgate is in your team,
he's articulate enough to say
he can deal with that environment when we get out there. All right, off you go type of thing. So that was that. So I'm waiting in the airport before we travel, and one of my colleagues is calling me saying, any idea who the captain's going to be, who's speaking tonight? And I'm saying, well, no, I'm not really sure. Then someone else, I spoke to Les Reed, I said, has he told the captain yet? He says, he hasn't. He's going to tell him on the plane, but it's going to be so-and-so. I said, all right, okay, no problem. So then my colleague's ringing back and says, and we're literally boarding the plane. He says, can you just tell me so I can at least keep these guys at bay while we're waiting for you guys to land? And I thankfully didn't tell my colleague, because as I'm on the plane, I see Howard get up and walk past the individual that I'd been told was going to be the captain. I thought, oh, maybe it is going to be Gareth. Then he walks past Gareth, and then he sits down next to Martin Keown, and Martin Keown got the captaincy for that game. And blimey, Martin, he walked into a right old firestorm of a media conference that night. It's like when people talk about media training and you see people in very calm environments getting this one-on-one calm back and forth questions back and forth. You know, you're talking about 250 journalists who are really fired up, live on TV, all having a real go in the room, and that was lively. But yeah, that was one with Howard. Probably my closest working experience with Sven, who I worked with for a long time. Not immediately as his main press officer, because we had different people at different points, but I picked up the more senior baton during that reign. And Sven and I are still very close to this day. I saw him literally about 2 weeks before lockdown started. I went out to Sweden for a meeting with him on something else. And, you know, we're not someone who's speaking every 5 minutes, but there was real trust between Sven and myself. And obviously there were pretty intense days with the media during that period. Yeah.
And then moving on, Gareth Southgate becoming the England manager as well. Good friend of yours and a manager that you'd known as a player going back to Middlesbrough.
Yeah, so obviously I observed quite closely when he took over at Middlesbrough. I remember Gareth ringing me, actually. He was at the World Cup. I think he was working for ITV at the time, and we just arrived in Cologne with the team. We were playing Sweden, and Gareth, he did just message me just to let me know that he was going to be taking over at Borough, which was nice of him to do so. It may have come along a little bit early, but I think people forget that he took over a team that had just been the UEFA Cup final. And for the first 2 seasons, there was quite a bit of change within that group of players, but he still comfortably kept them in the mid-table of the Premier League for his first 2 seasons and got to the FA Cup quarter-final on 2 occasions as well. So admittedly, they got relegated, I think it was in his 3rd season, but there was a lot more younger players involved in the group by then. There'd been quite a turnover of players. He didn't have people like Mark Schwarzer anymore, which was obviously a big loss for any team of, you know, outside of maybe the top 3 or 4 in the Premier League for sure. So Gareth probably did a better job at Middlesbrough than people who don't follow it closely recall.
Yeah.
It was Trevor Brooking who also is such a wonderful man, Trevor. Trevor wanted to try and get Gareth back into the frame somewhere, and Gareth was really open to. He came in a role that was it was working with the development teams. I can't remember. It might have been something like head of elite development, something like that was his role. But he engaged himself right across the organisation. You know, he was the guy who would go out to, meetings of county FAs and town hall meetings to talk to people about the the need to change small-sided football to get us more on an even field with a lot of what our European counterparts are doing in countries like Spain and Germany and so forth at the time. He's so committed to it because that's just the nature of the person. So he did. I can't remember how long he did with that, but it was great having him around. And then when Stuart Pearce, when his time came up with the 21s, and we went out and we interviewed a lot of people. It was Trevor, Dan Ashworth, and myself. We interviewed a number of different people for that job, and some very interesting and really credible people that we met with. But that's when we got Gareth back into the organisation, and for me, it was a no-brainer for me. Gareth just epitomises what a national team coach should be all about, and the fact that he understood playing for England at an elite level, that he maximised his career, as we discussed earlier, that his standards were at the highest level. His communication skills are absolutely brilliant. That just, for me, meant he is the ideal fit for what you want from a national team coach. And obviously since then, he developed a really strong bond with that 21s team. And I went out and I did one game with them in Croatia, where they played really well. Harry Kane was playing that day up front with Saido Berahino, actually. And we won 2-1, I think it was, to win a UEFA playoff game to go to the finals tournament. And the spirit in that group after the game, the collectiveness, and you could see how close Steve, Holland and Gareth were as well, which I think is a really important partnership. I was just so impressed. I left the organisation about a year or so afterwards. But then when it came to the time that obviously Roy moved on from the job, and the FA decided to go with Sam Allardyce, I always felt Gareth was an England manager in waiting. So when things occurred as they did with Sam, it was just, maybe again, fate played its part for the FA because of what happened with Sam, but that created the pathway for Gareth to walk in. And I just think, again, it just shows what a great fit it is, and the way that he's managed to make it an enjoyable experience for the players to play for England. He's taken away a lot of the pressure. The players clearly love playing for him. There's no doubt about that. And the communication between the players and Gareth, I think away from England time, seems to be first class as well, where they feel that they've got a dialogue with him all the time, which is, I just think he's just spot on. You look at some of the other countries that have been successful in years gone by, and look, we may not win anything, but we've got as good a chance as ever of being right at the top table for a significant period of time with the players that have emerged, and that's really important. He's got players that are there. His style of management is perfect for where we are at the moment. He's still a relatively young man, so he can connect and talk to them, and I think he's perfect in that regard.
And I think the communication between England and its supporters, it's paramount. It's fundamental in the growth of the football team. Do you believe, Adrian? Yeah,
100%. And I look at what they did before they went to Russia, where they did this big engagement piece and more about the communication during the tournament. I mean, look, again, without someone like Gareth who wants to be part of driving that, it's very difficult to make that happen. Part of me and some of my colleagues have talked about this previously, that it seems to be a lot has been forgotten about some of the stuff that we did ourselves before we went to tournaments. We did do huge press days where, when we were at training camps in Sardinia or in Portugal, places like La Manga, places I can remember where, pretty much the whole squad was made available. I think the difference was that team that we had back in the 2002 to 2006 time, the golden generation, which was a really unfortunate tag. There was a lot of individual stars in that group. There was also a lot of ownership from the clubs. There was a lot of big agents around it, and I just feel that there's more of a team. I'm not saying they haven't got big stars in the current setup, but there just seems to be more of a team element about it. That's how I see it from afar, and I just think again that's down to Gareth for the way, and the people at the FA for the way that they've managed to build that relationship. A lot of work went on with the England DNA that Dan Ashworth, Dave Redding, Matt Crocker were involved in trying to understand what the problems were. But it's also, go back to 2009, I think it was, when Trevor Brooking did an interview while we were down in South Africa for the World Cup draw. And he said then, we're in for a difficult period for the first half of the next decade because we don't have the players. But the latter half of the next decade, we should come good. Well, to be fair, what he said was absolutely bang on. If you don't have the players, it's very difficult. I'm not saying that we couldn't have potentially done a little bit better in previous tournaments, but you've got to have the good players to give you the real chance to win things.
Is it all about creating the right mindset though, and the right ethos, and having the right players who can, you're bringing them up through the junior ranks, so like you're kind of instilling these positive beliefs into your players?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's also, look, that can be applied not just to the England setup. You can apply it to any business, any industry, but I think in football, it's about deciding what you want to be at the very outset and what your values and principles are. Do you have a style of play that you want to have that runs right the way through your youth setup, whether it be club or country? And again, back to the standards, what's expected so everybody knows, but also that you'll support those players and individuals involved in the organisation during the tough times, communicating well as a group internally and externally. But the internal communication is as important as external communication, but then making it an enjoyable environment that means hard work, high standards, but also something where people can relax. I think I saw that with Chris Coleman, with Wales. And the way, look, they obviously had a superstar in Gareth Bale during that tournament, but Aaron Ramsey was absolutely amazing. But the team as a whole played fantastic for Wales in 2016. But Chris, as a man manager, and I wasn't as directly linked. It was more about the project as a whole for a year going into that tournament. But I was in and out of the team hotel, and I spent a little bit of time with Chris and Ocean Roberts and Kit Simmons and people like that. And Chris Coleman, his man management was absolutely fantastic, and he was brilliant at taking any pressure away. But I would say that the advantage the Welsh had insofar as what I'd experienced with England was that they just didn't have the same level of expectation or pressure which we'd had with England. And I can only say that going into tournaments in, say, Germany in 2006 and then South Africa in 2010, that the level of pressure was absolutely intense. And it's very difficult, I think, for anybody to perform to their highest level if they're not feeling relaxed, if the pressure levels are quite so high.
Yeah, certainly. I'm going to bring Brent in. I know he's been listening intently there. Come in, Brent, with some. What do you make of?
I just think for anyone listening, it's a great insight. I could sit here and listen for another hour. It's absolutely fantastic. And what I've got to say is this: for any aspiring young, not just footballer, I'm not just talking football, but anybody that's young and wants to get involved in football at the, progress at the highest level, and be that on the football field, be that a coach, be that a manager, or be that in the communications department. You just heard it from first hand here from Adrian. He's kind of from a working class background. He's been passionate from a young age. He's been passionate about football. He's dreamt, things in life, and he kind of lived the dream, if you will, by certain things happening in his life that he's fallen in the right place at the right time. That's kind of opened even more doors for him. But the good thing that you can take from this, them doors only open is if you're good at your job. And there's no doubts in my mind. I followed Adrian for quite a few years, his pathway and everything about Adrian. And he's kind of, and it epitomizes the person because of kind of coming on. We're just little Bacup Borough here, up in the Northwest Counties League.
At the moment.
At the moment. But you know what I mean? We've got such a top guy in football that's been around the top people and been part of it. And like you just said there, his insight in, it'll be great for you, Steve, because you must have learned just in this half an hour that we've had, you must have learned so much from what Adrian's saying. And I just think for anybody listening, you know, I touch on certain things that Adrian kind of mentioned, where he says, you know, you've got to be prepared to get your hands dirty. You know, I relate to a lad that we had here a few seasons ago and I've talked to you about him a lot of times, where I took him under my wing from the UCFB in Jay Taylor. You know, I think Jay, and I kind of let Jay Taylor, I gave him a bit of advice from my angle, what, you know, in terms of certain situations. But then from that, I kind of allowed him to get access to certainly good people that I kind of know in Sky, like Peter Smith, who he got access to him, and he's learned a little bit off Peter Smith, and you know, and then since then he's gone on to doing quite well with himself in terms of that. And I think Jay is a prime example. He could go a long way because he kind of thinks outside the box.
And he's got the desire as well.
And he's got the desire, and that's kind of important. So yeah, I think and kind of like how Adrian were talking about as a manager, and I can sit here and think about on two different types of managers when you think about it. He's talked about there of Gareth Southgate and a Chris Coleman. Now, I kind of, Adrian will probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but I kind of think they're kind of two different kinds of people, but spot on in both ways that they do it. You know, like Chris Coleman, I look, you know, even when he went, you know, I've always said about Chris Coleman, even in the past, you know, when he was from his Fulham days and things like that, Chris Coleman is a good manager. And,
very intelligent and articulate.
Oh, he's a good manager. And, you know, even when he went to, and I can sit and listen to his interviews and everything about him. I think I kind of like to shave a bit of take a little bit off Chris in myself. You know what I mean? He's kind of that kind. Whereas Gareth,
I think if you, sorry to cut across you there. I think if you were a player in the dressing room, you'd want to play for Chris Coleman.
Yeah, I get that 100%. I really do. And I get it also that players will want to play for Gareth in a different way, because Chris and Gareth, while there's still the two very astute coaches, managers in kind of what they do, they're kind of different characters. Am I right in that, Adrian?
Every manager's different, and I think it's something you highlighted at the very beginning of the talk today. They're all totally different. And it's like people, you know, Gareth, for example, I don't think you necessarily see too much of it on TV. He's got a brilliant sense of humour, very light sense of humour. Chris is obviously more of a bigger personality. I think that's just the way that he is. But I don't mean that in a negative way. I just think he's got an aura about him that's a big personality. But then, you know, someone like Sven-Göran Eriksson, who obviously is not an imposing character, but a lot of those players, and not necessarily all of them, but a lot of those players from that team, of that England team that he had, or players that played for him with Gothenburg or with Lazio or with Roma or people like that, Sampdoria, they really loved him. And what he was good at with big players, he didn't try and shackle them. He let them breathe. So that was his way of giving them the slack to want to play for him. And so he built teams with that kind of approach. Fabio Capello was someone who obviously was a lot more of a domineering, demanding individual. But again, what people don't see, you know, once the curtains closed, is that actually Fabio's got quite a good sense of humour. I think the challenge for Fabio when he was in England was obviously the language was a problem for him, or certainly for some of the players. And the natural character didn't always come through because of the language clunkiness. But I've seen, you know, I've travelled with Fabio for the best part of 18 months in particular before we went to South Africa, and I've seen him, you know, picking back up or being on the telephone with some of his former players. I'm talking, you know, big players like Fabio Cannavaro. I remember being in a car with Fabio somewhere when Cannavaro called him, and they were laughing for 10, 15 minutes on the phone, speaking in Italian. So that doesn't happen unless someone's got real respect.
Yeah.
You know, so that as you say, they all have different ways. Roy was someone who I felt garnered respect from, someone like Steven Gerrard. He looked at Roy. They knew how hard he worked on the training ground, and Roy treated them like men as well. Roy again is someone who has very high standards. Roy is someone who is incredibly polite and decent when he meets people. But trust me, there's a side to Roy that isn't always seen by when the cameras are away. Where Roy can be a really fiery individual, and I think it surprises people when they see it for the first time. But trust me, when Roy goes, he can go as volcanic as a Fabio Capello can.
God, tell us more.
No, just on going. One thing that I've kind of noticed going back to Gareth as well. Watching England over the years with the different coaches. I always said, and that you've worked closely with these people. I go back to the Terry Venables era, where Terry Venables seemed to like. It was just unfortunate that what the ending that ended with Terry. But I always think that just at that time, the country loved England.
There was something happening.
There was something happening. You felt there was something happening. And you know what? Again, correct me if I'm wrong here, Adrian, but I kind of sense that a little bit now. They've brought that now. We irrespective. This is no disrespect to all the other coaches we've named today, but I kind of sense that same situation now with Gareth. Very, very similar situation to the Terry Venables kind of era.
I totally agree. And again, two very different personalities. And look, I didn't work with Terry directly during that period. I got to know Terry a little bit when he worked with Steve McLaren. Terry was described as Steve's assistant. I would say Terry was very much someone on the side of Steve, who would be passing on his experience, and that's what Steve was looking for when he brought Terry in, because he had other good coaches like Steve Round in the setup as well, and Steve himself was a very good coach. But speaking to any of those players who played in that Euro '96 tournament, that you will never find one player who says anything other than how much they respect and love Terry for the way of his management style. I think his man management skills were probably, that's not to underplay the coach. He's always been a tactician and a coach, even as a player by all accounts. But his man management skills were absolutely fantastic. And you can see that with the career that he's had, and it's a real shame. I agree that Terry couldn't have had longer as an England manager, because it just seemed to be that some people, I think the job suits them because the job doesn't faze them. And it's the same as with big club jobs. You see some managers who've maybe never played or worked as a coach, as the main coach in the big clubs. I think the first time they're exposed to it, you can see their eyes.
A rabbit in headlights.
Yeah, to a degree. And it's like, because trust me, there's a huge difference between being at a club that is a mid-ranking Premier League club to being with an England or with one of the top 4 or 5 Premier League clubs, because the magnitude of scrutiny and exposure and the caliber of players that you are suddenly leading, where you've got to have that level of respect yourself from them. That's a different dynamic completely. And that's why when you see someone like, when Eriksson walked in with England, he just left Lazio, who won Serie A the season before. So whatever anyone might have thought of Sven down the line, he's walked in with that kudos. He's walked in. That gives him authority in that room. Yeah. When Capello walked in, they just looked at his CV and he has that manner anyway. Terry is someone who will be a warm, genial person, but he's still got the CV to back it up. And I think, you look at someone like Sir Alex, even though he had those difficult first few years at United, he was still coming off the back of doing an unbelievable job with Aberdeen. So it gives you that credibility when you walk in. I think without that, I'm not saying it's impossible, because people like Pochettino have proved that it's not impossible, but it can be a challenge for some.
But having that persona, walking down the corridors on the first day, it kind of gives you a little bit of breathing space as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that can be applied to the players who are the most important. Obviously, I think it's important that I say that I think sometimes in conversations we talk about football and everything that goes on around it, but ultimately the most important people in football are the players. The players and the manager, because they're the people who have either got to cross the white line or organise what's doing across the white line, and the rest of us are all bit part players in that. But if you can build the right model around those people, the right support mechanisms, the right culture, the right environment, you give yourself a real good chance of success. But as a member of staff, when you are in an environment, or when you're in a training ground, or when you're in a hotel with a national team, when someone is a manager who holds real respect, kudos, you can feel that aura, without even turning around to actually see them. It's there.
But it needs to be there. It belongs there, doesn't it? Otherwise, you're not successful.
Yeah, but I think there's also getting the balance between the aura being there and it being a positive aura, and not being an aura of total
dictatorship. Yeah,
and that's where I think you look at someone. We mentioned Terry, and you mentioned Gareth now, and you mentioned Chris Coleman, because Gareth and Chris, who, as I said, are both 49, 50 years old, which is for me still a relatively young manager, still got a lot of time ahead of them. But they're well capable of going along the corridor anywhere and just putting their arm on the shoulder of any player and giving them that warm conversation. I'm not saying it doesn't mean they're not capable of being disciplined as well, but I think the days of throwing teacups around and yelling and screaming at people, I just think they're not for this generation of player. They're not for this generation of young person. The minute you start shouting at people these days, you've probably lost your own authority. And I kind of found that a little bit myself from a communications point of view. When I first started out, it was a really competitive environment, and you look back in time, there was some massive characters on the journalistic circuit at that point. People like Joe Melling, Brian Woolnough, Bob Cass. You've got people like Stephen Howard and John Sadler. They're just names that come off the top of my head. Those guys never shied away from confrontation, and I found myself, with some of the people and some of the younger ones who were coming through. Sean Custis, who's now one of the senior sports editors in the industry. Sean and I had some of the biggest ding-dongs anyone could imagine. But I remember one of my colleagues, Scott Field, who's now the communications director at the British Olympic Association, saying to me, probably about 3 or 4 years before I left the FA, saying, "Look, you can't deal with people like that anymore." We had a new generation of journalists coming through, and he said, "You can't talk to them like that anymore." He was not putting me in my place, but he was giving me some really sage advice, and I'll never forget him saying that to me, because things had changed, and I think it's the same with dealing with players.
Yeah, definitely.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting what you're saying, Adrian. It's been a really interesting kind of hour, and it's been a real pleasure to have you on here and give our listeners in this terrible time, really. I know hopefully we're coming out of it at the other side, but just one thing I would like to ask you, Adrian, because you're such a like I said, I have followed your career pathway and watch you from a distance and things, how you go about things and everything, and I just think what's the next for Adrian Bevington? I know that it's my opinion about the Scottish what's going on up in Scotland, and I really do, and I said it I don't say things cheaply. I really mean it. I think that somebody like you could really give the Scottish FA and the Scottish football a massive uplift, and I think it needs somebody like you, to be fair, Adrian. I think it really does.
Well, thanks for the kind words, and I do appreciate it. Look, from my own point of view, I left Borough at the end of December, and I had a few things that were circling around, but obviously with everything that's happened with COVID, that's kind of put various things on hold. So like a lot of people, I'm kind of just waiting now to see what is going to be next I'd like to think I can stay in football because without trying to be too arrogant, I think I have got a lot to offer, particularly with my experience, but also I've got things that I want to achieve. I want to be successful personally, and I want to be part of something that is successful. And I'm a way more qualified person now sitting here than I was 15 years ago when I was sat at the FA. So, let's see what happens. Hopefully something will come round, not in the not too distant future, and we'll go from there. But other than that, I'd just like to say to you guys, I really, really appreciate the time this morning. It's been, good questions, good to chat, and I hope it has been enjoyable and useful for you.
I was just going to finish with one question because we're not going to probably won't chat to you for quite some time. As a football club, Bacup Borough Football Club, semi-professional football club, what can we do, Adrian? Give us some advice about going forward and kind of working more with the communities and building up them bonds with the communication aspects.
Look, it's tough, and I ain't got all the answers, and I've been a chairman of a smaller club down in Bishop Stortford at one point, and I'm a member of the North Riding County FA board as an independent director. I appreciate, without knowing all the detail, the challenges that are faced by smaller clubs, important clubs, all clubs in the pyramid. I think your engagement piece is important. Obviously you're very proactive on social and digital media. I think that's absolutely key. Anything you can do with community clubs where you can provide any support, whether it be through coaching or just engaging to get kids playing as much as possible. I think, look, ultimately, the more that people think that you are an accessible club for everybody, that's the most important thing, and that you make it easy for people to come and watch you or be part of you. And in doing that, communicate in whichever platform method that you can, as many as you can, but keep your messaging really simple. Keep it as cost effective as you can, keep it as simple as you can, but keep the messaging as consistent. And the answer should always try to be yes, if you can possibly make it yes.
Brilliant. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Sports Bar Show.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Adrian.